Welcome to the Pittsfield Historical Society. My name is Mark Reel. I'm one of the directors here, and like I said, I recognize a lot of faces, and welcome to all of you. And we're happy that you came here to join us on our second program for 2023. Our next program is going to be on the 14th of June at Greylag, so put that on your calendars. We hope that you'll join us here to learn about the history of Greylag. Tonight we're very fortunate to have Mike George with us. Mike's going to talk to us about the history of glassmaking in New Hampshire and the surrounding communities. We don't believe that there was a glassmaker in Pittsfield, but there was some close. Suncook, I guess, is the closest. But very pleased to have Mike here, and we look forward to the presentation. So, great.
Looks like history is alive and well in Pittsfield, which is nice to see. Great to see young folks here too as well. So my name is Michael George, and I was born and raised in New Hampshire, and started out in Manchester, raised my family in New Boston, and now we live up in the Lakes region. But I'm an avid bottle, flask, and early American glass collector. And I started at a young age, like a lot of collectors do. I was about 9 years old or so, and just digging in the backyard, and I came across a little bottle. And I just was curious about what it was, you know, how it got there, how old it was, and you have all these questions that run through your head. So it kind of sent me on a tangent of learning more about the bottle. And then a friend and I, way before we were able to drive, used to get on our Huffies and go down to the library and look up the history of the towns and where the houses were, and then we found out where the dumps were. And so we spent our weekends kind of checking out cellar holes and hitting the old city dumps. So that's kind of how a lot of collectors start. I was fortunate enough to be able to learn a little bit more about it, get some books, references, and learn a lot of the history of the glass objects. And it kind of sent me off in a whole lifelong collecting tangent, I guess. So. And now I'm here today. So if you just bear with me, I'm just going to be advancing the slides as I go. So just to talk about the early glassmaking process. And glassmaking has been around since the Roman days, and the process is always pretty much the same. You need wood to heat the furnaces to temperature. You know, today in some of the studios they'll use gas and other ways of heating up the furnaces, but back then it was all heat by wood. You need the right mixtures of ingredients: quartz, silica or sand, potash, lime, oxides, etc. And then they added chemicals also to give it different colors or take colors out. A free-blown process or a mold-blown process. So a lot of the objects where the glass was blown into a mold. Or prior to that, you know, they would just use a free-blown process and use paddles to kind of shape the bottle. So blowpipe, a ponnel rod, and manipulating tools. The blowpipe is what the gaffer uses to blow the glass. And then the ponnel rod is what they attach to the bottom of the bottle, and that allows them to snap it off from where they were blowing the bottle and then shape the lip. And also any kind of manipulating tools. And then you obviously need a glass blower or a gaffer. And then there's a process called the annealing process. That's a cooling process that takes place, and that's real important, and that can sometimes take up to 48 hours for the cooling process. Wrong temperature, or if there's little impurities in the glass, it could cause it to crack pretty quickly. So in the U.S., glassmaking started as early as the Jamestown settlement in 1608. They dug a lot of shards there, and glassmaking was literally the first industry in the New World. So jars, bottles, and drinking vessels were found there. But at that time, and going forward through the whole colonial period, a lot of the glass was imported. And it was that way because we were still under the rule of the king, and they didn't want us enterprising and making money. So a lot of it had to have been imported. During the early to mid 18th century, first stable glass houses really emerged in the New Jersey and New York areas, and a lot of the factories there were with skilled German and English glass blowers, and they brought over their traditions and their styles, And that was known as the German influence or German tradition of glass blowing during that time frame. A lot of those glass blowers ended up migrating up to the New England area, and then eventually a lot of them migrated out to the Midwest. And a lot of the styles and techniques were passed on from master glass gaffer to the apprentices, and the apprentices would pick up the styles. But you can see here that back then, glass blowing was really somewhat of an art form. You know, there was a lot of regular production work, commercial type work that was done, but a lot of the creative stuff was just, you know, incredibly done. And like anything else, you know, they were craftsmen, and you can certainly see it in the work. Like this pair of gadroon candlesticks. These are elaborately designed with gadrooning, and then they have a little knob inside with a seated Liberty dime in 1842 when it was made, then with an attached pedal foot. But that's kind of the style that you would see in the early to mid 19th century. However, most of the wares were always utilitarian type wares because they had to be able to produce things that they could use. Money was always tight, and some of these objects were reused over and over again. So these kind of objects that you see here are the type of utilitarian wares that households would have back in the late 18th century, early 19th century. So it's kind of like a country, and then these were upscale type wares or more decorative type wares. And those would have been done at the Sandwich Glass Factory and some of these other high-end flint glass factories. And they would have been for the wealthy that lived down on, you know, Fifth Avenue in New York, or in some of the, you know, high-end cities. Most of the New England wares, though, between 1780 and 1840 were free-blown and common junk type bottles is what they would categorize them as. And these are chestnut bottles. They're probably the most common type of bottle of that period from 1780 to 1820. And what they were basically just a free-blown bottle, and then they would paddle the sides in tight, so they kind of resembled an American chestnut. And then they would put them into a leather case or something, and they'd be able to go around and transport them pretty easily. And you could put basically anything in them and just reuse them. Pattern molding was the art of being able to take like a grooved mold and blow the glass into the grooved mold and be able to get this design. So that was like the next step after the free-blown wares, like the chestnuts. They would actually create these ribbed inkwells and ribbed flasks based upon the mold rib count. And then when they would take them out, sometimes they would spin them, and it would give it a nice turned effect. And they could even sometimes be able to double dip them, so it would give them a double ribbed pattern. Another common type of bottle back then, which you see a lot in early pirate type bottles. These are like the ales and porters and wines. And these were known as black glass of the time, and a lot of it was done in England, but it was also done here in America from the 17th century right up through the mid-19th century. And sometimes they had seals on them, and that was their way of kind of embossing or labeling their bottle. If somebody was very wealthy, it would say, you know, Sir John so-and-so, 1763. So he'd be able to keep his own, you know, group of bottles and be able to reuse them and put his vintage wine into them. For transporting, there was gins and carboys and demijohns. And the gins, you could see, were square, and they would be able to fit in a case like that. So they'd be able to fit a dozen or so into a case. And the carboys or demijohns were large bottles, and those typically had wicker on them, and so they could go right onto ships or go onto a cart and just be able to be transported long distances, filled with liquids. And surprisingly, a lot of them actually survived. And now today, some of them have tattered wicker, and collectors will take the wicker off and see a beautiful bottle. I try to keep the wicker on if it looks good, just because it retains the historical aspect of the piece. So that's kind of an overview of the common bottles that you'd see here in New England during that time frame. The first glass factory actually started in Salem, Massachusetts in 1639, and it was kind of short-lived, and there isn't a whole lot of history on it. It was down on Glassfield Road, and there's some accounts of people finding glass there. But I don't know of any bottles that were ever recovered from those factories. But in New Hampshire, there was a number of different factories, starting as early as the Temple Glass Works in 1780. But there was Keene also, which had a number of different factories. And then the Pembroke Glass Works in Suncook, the Stoddard Works in Mill Village of Stoddard, and also South Stoddard, and then the Lineborough Glass Works. So the glass industry in New Hampshire ranged from 1780 until 1886. The New England Glass Works in Temple was the earliest one, and that was Robert Hughes. And Robert Hughes started this crown glass production, which is, crown glass is actually window glass. And what they would do is they would actually spin the glass like a pizza, and the centrifugal force would make it larger and larger, and then they would be able to score that glass and be able to get window panes out of that. But so in the piece that you see here pictured, and it's right down over here, that was that came out of a transom at a doorway in Mason, New Hampshire, in 1780, and very, very likely production of the Temple Works. And that would have been the center part of that pizza. You know, when they're spinning it and holding it with the pontil rod, or the pontil, that would be the center bullseye of the glass. Let's see, so some of this glass that you see here, the little wine cordial and some of the vials, that was also byproducts of the Temple Works. Most of it was window glass though. And who was Robert Hughes? He came from Boston, and he was an entrepreneur from Boston. And he came to Temple, New Hampshire, and started a factory in Temple. And the reason why he went to Temple was because of the raw materials that were available there. There was an abundance of wood and plenty of the sand or the silica that he needed for making his glass. So he built a factory up on the side of Kidder Mountain, and he was actually frowned upon by the town because he was from Boston. They didn't care for that, and he was also harboring Hessian soldiers, which were Germans that were working with the British. So they were also glass blowers. So he used them as glass blowers, but they were kind of defecting from the British colony, so they were considered to be illegal. So he operated that for about a year and a half, and then his factory actually burned down. And in a desperate move, he tried getting the town to help him rebuild the factory, and they said, "No way, you're out." So he didn't last very long. He only lasted about a year and a half there, but it was known as the first glass factory in America, because it was in 1780, and we were a country at that time. So that's a pretty important thing. And Deming Jarvis in 1854, who ran the whole started and ran the sandwich glass factory, called Hughes Factory in New Hampshire the first attempt to establish window glass in the Western world. So Hughes ended up leaving Temple, and he went to Boston, and he operated a large crown glass factory in Boston and then in Connecticut as well. Some of the identification of the glass produced at Temple are here. Little vial bottles, utility bottles. These shards were excavated either at the furnace site or within the proximity. I found that bottle in Peterborough while scuba diving in the river there, which was only about 3 or 4 miles away from that site. And you see some more comparisons there. how the lip treatment is, the Ponel scar, and this is just kind of glass geek type of stuff. More comparisons. The wine that I showed you that's right there, that's a piece that was found at the site, the wine stem. And then these are handles for maybe free blown wares. And then some lip treatments. Most of the glass that was output at that factory is in that green tone, almost a light to medium emerald green. There were some other colors that were found there, but 95+% was in that kind of green color. And it's really hard changing the color of glass. You have to add all kinds of chemicals, and there's an alchemist type book that's highly regarded. It's like the sacred book back then, and that kept all the secret ingredients for making glass. There was one piece that was uncovered back in the 1950s by Richard Boo Morcom, and it was a seal, and it says Robert Hughes, manufacturer, 1781. He actually, I knew him pretty well, and he picked it up and he thought it was a stone, and he was going to throw it out, and then he realized it was green and it was glistening, and come to find out it was a seal. So that was a seal of the Robert Hughes that started the factory. So after that burnt down, it was almost 35 years later before the next glass production resumed in New Hampshire. And that would have been in the Keene Glass Works. And the Keene Glass Works operated for a pretty long time, from 1815 to the mid-1840s. And there was a glass factory on Washington Street, which was for window glass. There was supposedly another factory not too far from that site on Gilsum Street, but the majority of the glass blown in Keene was on Marlborough Street. So the Keene window glass, which operated from about 1814 to the mid-1850s, they advertised their glass. I have this sheet at home. They advertised that their glass is as good of quality as Redford or Saranac glass, but cheaper than Fulton Works in New Jersey. So they were pretty competitive back then. And they had different levels of the quality of their glass. They had Keene glass, Cheshire glass, and the lower end qualities were probably used just to make bottles. The higher end was probably used to make free blown wares, like like this kind of a piece here. That's just an offhand piece picture, and this is probably from Keene in that time frame, 1820s. The Keene Marlborough Street was actually started by Henry Rose Schoolcraft. He was one of the people that launched the factory, and he was young at the time. He was a teenager, but he came from a long line of glass blowers out of New York and Vermont. And he managed to run it for a couple of years. He ended up going on to doing other things. He's very well known as being an explorer who did the expedition through the Ozarks. But back then he really built up the factory, and he was also a mason, so he started creating Masonic flasks. And these are probably the first figured type flasks in America, the Sunburst and the Masonics, and they most of the time were made of a very heavy lead glass, and they're quite impressive. And this is one right here, and you can see it's just a beautiful quality. It has the Masonic arch, it has the Masonic tools, and on the other side has an eagle on it. It's a very patriotic looking flask. But this was kind of the start of what's known as the historical flasks in America. And a lot of them have beautiful motifs and things on them, which they're the most highly collected area in bottles. So let's see, when he ended up going through a little bit of financial difficulties in 1816, and then it traded hands again to Justice Perry. At the Keene Works, you'll get quite a variety of different glass output. The window glass is pretty basic. It's in different shades of aqua, from a very pale aqua to a deep bluish aqua. and you'll see it up there. They actually made some offhand pieces in that nice window glass. Flint glass is made, it's got a lead quality to it, so it's very heavy, but it's very, very fine. The glass output is beautiful. And the flint glass that was produced there, and it was only for a short time, 1814 to about early 1820s, but the flint glass is of nice quality and comes in a wide range of colors, although the most common color is colorless or clear. And you'll see some blown 3 mold there. And what blown 3 mold is, it's like this decanter here. And you can see that it has geometric designs to it. And the reason why they created this was because at the time there was a lot of cut glass that was coming into America from England and Ireland. And the cut glass was very expensive because it took so long to make. They would actually make facets and cut these nice diamond quilting and all the geometric shapes. So what we did over here was we actually made molds that looked like the cut glass and just blew bottles all day long in those molds. So it was a little Yankee ingenuity, but they were able to get quite a bit of market share by doing that. It kind of defeats the purpose when you're getting into color, though. That's a nice geometric design, but it certainly doesn't look like crystal. But now the colored blown 3 mold is very desirable. And then the bottle glass, which is considered their lower glass, that was used to make some of the other historical flasks when they were mass producing them in the 1830s and 40s. And then some of the other type of pieces like the pitkins and medicine bottles. So we went over the blown 3 mold glass and the Masonic flasks, and some of the those are sunburst flasks up there. Those are also quite early. But these are the kind of bottles that are really, really collectible today. They're rare, they've got some historical significance, and they're also quite beautiful. A lot of them came in some really, really incredible colors. Some of the figured flasks that were made, a lot of them have motifs that reflect what was going on in the country at the time, or have some patriotic images to them, like the eagle, Masonic flasks, the sunbursts, Washington Jackson. You'll see on some of the, I've got a little half pint right here. On one side it has General Washington, or George Washington. On the other side it has Andrew Jackson. And this bottle was made in the early 1830s to promote Andrew Jackson. Obviously, George Washington was the father figure of the country, and he had his picture on the other side, so he would have some of these made and probably filled with a little liquor and pass them out to his constituents. The railroad was just starting out in the 1830s, so you do see quite a few historical flasks that have the railroad on them. And then the flint glass objects were decanters, bottles, Masonics and sunbursts, pitchers, creamers, bowls, pans, tumblers, all that. So, as I mentioned, the first historical flasks ever produced could have been done at Keene or Connecticut. They were kind of at the same time frame of these flasks. While I was in Keene, and they were doing some digging up on Washington Street, and there was that other glass factory right on Gilsum Street, and they were digging it up, and I was seeing a lot of shiny things going on in there, so I got excited. But they started digging up where the oven was, and I found some shards there, and I was able to compare them to some pieces that I had. And prior to that, there was no way to, there was always said that they were made at Keene, and that was information that's kind of passed down from generation to generation of collector and written in books, but there was nothing really conclusive. So it was nice to be able to find some shards there and know that they came from the site and were compared to the pieces. So that's kind of the history and the pieces that go together in solving the puzzle for these things. Like any other hobby, there's always reproductions that you have to be cautious about. Some of them are pretty obvious, like you know, the less oil bottles that look like historical flasks. Back in the 60s and 70s, when there was a big bottle craze and flasks were highly desirable, Less came out with this whole line. But even prior to that, in the 1930s and 40s, there were bottles that were being produced to look like some of the early American flasks. Even in Czechoslovakia, they were making some that could fool a lot of, you know, young new collectors. But after a while, you kind of understand. Like these two were done in Czechoslovakia, and you'll notice that the mane on the horse is the hair on the mane on the horse kind of stands straight up, and that's the indication that it's a reproduction. So as a collector, you start to learn these things. And then Old Sturbridge Village did a Masonic flask, but Justice Perry was actually in the oval an IP. Back then J was an I, or looked like an I. So, but their reproduction was a big J, which wouldn't have been done back then. So you can tell the differences. Bless you.
Thank you.
So in 1842, the Keene Glass Factory finally ended up closing their doors because of financial reasons. I don't know what they were, but they ended up having to liquidate all of their assets and have an auction. So the primary glass gaffer, or the top gaffer there, his name was Joseph Foster, and he ended up buying all of the accounts and all of the molds and all of the tools and everything that went with the factory, and he moved the operations and started the operations in Stoddard, New Hampshire. And so he actually started an industry in Stoddard that lasted over 30 years. And at one point, Stoddard, New Hampshire was 3 times the size that it is today, back in the 1840s and 50s, which is pretty amazing. It's a pretty small town today, but back then it was thriving. So there was a number of different factories there. In Mill Village, there was the Granite Glass Company, and then it burned, and they ended up starting the new Granite Glass Company, I think around 1860. And then in South Stoddard was Joseph Foster's first furnace and his second furnace. And there was the South Stoddard Works, the Weeks Glass Works, and the Weeks and Gilson factory. These here are they're kind of iconic flasks from Stoddard because they have a nice 13-star flag on them. And on the other side, this is it right here. You got a side, and on the other side it says New Granite Glass Works, Stoddard, New Hampshire. So the output at Mill Village in South Stoddard is a lot darker and more earthy tones than you saw prior. Most of them are in hues of amber, from honey amber to a deep chocolate amber. And then at South Stoddard you see some golden amber to reddish amber colors. You do see some olive, but olive is a little bit more scarce in the Stoddard glass. Some of the bottles that were made at Stoddard that with positive attribution, the flasks, they're known as double eagle flasks. Some of them just have the eagles on both sides. Some of them say Stoddard, New Hampshire on one side, and some of them say Granite Glass Works, Stoddard, New Hampshire on the ovals. Then there's the flag flasks, which you just saw. The lettered Granite Glass Company flasks, like these down here. Then there's an all-seeing eye Masonic flask and a Byron Scott flask. Then there's some base embossed bottles, the Weeks and Gilson, South Stoddard, New Hampshire, and then the Weeks Glass Works. This is just a Weeks cylinder, so that's Stoddard glass, and then at the bottom it says Weeks Glass Works. Stoddard is very well known for making molds or bottles for private doctors or apothecaries or merchants. Because back then the snake oils and the elixirs and cures and remedies and all that was really starting to build up. So a lot of private molds that were done there, like the Farley's ink wells that were made in Marlow, New Hampshire, the next town over. Kimball's jaundice bitters. I think I have one here, yeah. So this is a Kimball's jaundice bitters, and it's in the kind of the green color, which is a little unusual. But from Troy, New Hampshire, and on this side it says bitters. And then the Dr. Stephen Jewett's celebrated health restoring bitters from Rindge, New Hampshire. So there's some really crazy ones. Yeah, the Seaver's joint and nerve liniment, Howard's cancer and canker syrup, G.W. Stone's liquid cathartic. There's the I. Newton's blood purifier. Just it goes on and on, but it actually adds to the excitement for collectors because some of these concoctions are really exciting to see in the embossing on the bottles. And during the late 1850s, early 1860s, mineral water springs started cropping up, most of them in New York, but there was a couple of them that were in Vermont, and then there was one in Henniker, New Hampshire. The magnetic springs, which you see there. But they made a lot of bottles for these private mineral water springs, like the Middleton Healing Springs, the Alberg, High Rock, Congress and Empire, the magnetic springs in Henniker, which is the only one in New Hampshire, Caledonia, Saratoga Springs, which a lot of people have heard about, Iodine Springs, that's this one right here, from South Hero, Vermont. And then this is a pint-size Congress and Empire springs from New York. But you can see the same type of golden, earthy Stoddard glass, which a lot of people really like. It's always been a popular thing. The Poland water, which that is right here. I have had one of the Poland water bottles, the earliest ones. And they're a nice red amber. They're really, really nice. But there's only maybe 8 or 9 of them out there that are known, so they're pretty rare. The Bedford water is a nice bottle as well from Bedford, Mass, not New Hampshire. So a couple of other unique characteristics of Stoddard glass. There's a petal type ponnel scar. I've got some of those ponnel rods. And then the 16-panel umbrella inkwells and the Stoddard tombstone shaped medicines. Those are pretty iconic too of the Stoddard works. My wife and I actually owned the property for many years. We just sold it about a year ago because we didn't have enough time to really excavate it. That was our plan. And the market was so hot we had to sell. But this was where the first glass factory was in Mill Village. The red building was the office, and back here you see a foundation. That was where the factory was. There's my wife digging. She tore up the place. But we found this bottle. It's a pretty rare bottle. It says Otard Depuy cognac on it. We found a whole bunch of the seals there, so we know that they were made there. And it was really important to be able to find some of these excavated pieces and kind of answer a lot of the questions that we had. So, and I was able to document everything. So from a collector standpoint, it was really worthwhile. So kind of comparing the molds, that bottle was the only one that was known. I've got it in my collection, but it's the only one that anyone has ever seen, even from Bath, Maine. Nobody's ever found a piece, but we found some of the shards at the factory site, so it told us that they were made there. And the same thing with the Hutchins and Mason, which said Keene, New Hampshire, so a lot of people thought it was made at Keene, but it was actually made at Stoddard. And then some of the free-blown wares, some of the characteristics of these tablewares, you know, the cookie type foot you see on a lot of things, the threading, and that's a nice lily pad picture. That the lily pad design on it is known as a lily pad picture. Then some of these pieces, the rolling pins, and like this little open salt. It has the typical cookie foot on it. It's that nice starred color. So you get an idea of the type of glass, the offhand type glass that they produce there. There was a craftsman or glass gaffer by the name of Matt Johnson that worked at Keene and Stoddard, and he actually worked in New Jersey, New York, Canada, and he was probably the best at doing these lily pad designs, and he was probably one of the best gaffers out there. But he had a real drinking problem, so everybody wanted him, but then when they had him, they didn't want him. So a couple of these pieces that were made in New Hampshire, those are in my collection. That one's in the Cheshire Museum there, and it's only about this big, really cute piece. But he has a very certain style, and probably Curry Museum has one. He's well known as a great craftsman in glass. So some more of the shards that were found at Stoddard that originated from Keene, the railroad flasks, the sunbursts, all these things were found at the factory sites in Stoddard. And that's because Joseph Foster, who ended up buying out all the molds, just took the molds and reused them over in Stoddard. The molds were very expensive to make, so instead he just continued to blow glass in those molds. So glass quality, glass continued to operate for 30 years in Stoddard, and then I think it's because they couldn't produce any colorless glass. It was all this beautiful honey amber stuff and beautiful colored glass, but the trend in 1873 was colorless, and they weren't able to produce it. So, and I also think their location was a hindrance too, because with the railroads passing through, it was very difficult to get up into the Stoddard area. And there was another factory that was emerging, Limeboro, which had much easier access and had made beautiful aqua glass, so I think they started really eating into their business, and in 1873 the factory closed. The other factory that is fairly close by is the Pembroke Glass Works in Suncook, and they actually started in Chelmsford, Mass, and they moved their factories up to Pembroke or Suncook because they wanted to be near the Merrimack River, and they wanted to also be able to take the sand from Lake Massabesic because it was of the right quality for them. So they were making window glass. That's why I have a picture of the bullseye, but a lot of the like 1840s bullseye type glass and glass panes that you see in the old houses from those time frames were probably done at the Suncook Works. There isn't a lot of bottles that were made there, but these pieces are identified as being Suncook pieces, and it was a beautiful, brilliant bluish aqua color, and here you're seeing them as thick glass, but when it was a window glass, you'll see it has a little bit of a blue tint, but when you put it into these kind of free-blown wares, it really shows off the color. These were passed down through families. The one on the left, the picture on the left, is in my collection, and that was found by George McKieran in the 1920s in the town. So, and it came from a family. And then these other two pieces are in the Currier Museum. So the Pembroke Glass Works in Suncook lasted until 1850, but there isn't a whole lot that is known about them because they were doing primarily the window glass. I actually scuba dived in that area and found a lot of glass shards, but didn't find any whole bottles, and whatever is in the museums is the only items that we have, which we kind of saw some of them. But the longest lasting factory, and one of the most well-known factories, is the Limeboro Glass Factory, which operated from 1866 to 1886. There's a picture, a little postcard, and you can see all the big demijohns and the crates and everything. A friend of mine actually dug that site a few years ago, probably about 15 years ago. Found a lot of great things there. Lineborough Glass Factory was doing just a wide range of different objects, and they also had the railroad nearby, and they had great transportation, a lot of money behind them, and were able to get their wares out from as far south as Georgia and all the way out to the Midwest. So they did demijohns and carboys, whiskeys, beers, sodas, medicines and private molds, blackings and inks. Then the canning jars are fairly new, and butter jars and insulators and battery jars. All of that just started up in like the 1870s or so, but they were there to really gain that business. So color, strength, diversity of product offerings, and the customers ranging from Canada to Georgia made Lineborough kind of a powerhouse, and especially since other factories like Stoddard and then a number of factories in Connecticut closed down, it left Lineborough and only 2 other remaining factories in New England. So this was from some of the newspapers. In 1873, the Lineborough Glass Company is doing a brisk but not smashing business. One shipment of 6,000 demijohns had just made it to St. Louis. Daily use of 6 tons of coal, 4 cords of wood, and 70 employees and 14 blowers averaging $4 a day. They were also the first ones to get into coal. Prior to that, all the other factories were doing just wood. So that made things a little easier for them. Nearly 6,000 to 7,000 bottles, fruit jars, and carboys turned out daily. About a quarter of it is colored work. The rest of it would be in aqua glass. So the Moxie bottle you see on the left-hand side, that shows like that brilliant, nice bluish aqua color that they would make. They had their own mine as a silex mine, which would create the quartz, and they were producing 100 tons of quartz per week, and had enough to supply all the glass manufacturers for centuries. So they had all of the abundance of materials that they needed, and they crushed the silica to a flour consistency, and it's said that they ran it through some magnetization to be able to get the iron out. I don't know how accurate that is or not. Sounds good. They also ended up getting a lot of the molds and also some of the employees from the Stoddard Works. Joseph Foster, his brother George, sons George and Charlie. I'm glad I have that there. George operated one of the factories in Stoddard, and then he moved over to Lineborough, and Charles did as well. You don't hear much about Charles in Stoddard, but this factory, this family ended up operating in Stoddard and then operating and blowing glass in Lineborough as well. There you see a couple of molds, one on the left being from Stoddard, and that's the Dr. J.W. Poland, and then the one on the right is from Lineborough. So once again, wide range of colors offered, but the primary color being aqua. And there you see some early insulators. Those are telegraph insulators. I've got a real early one here that was made at Stoddard, and that's a threadless one, so that would just go right up on a pin. And it says Foster Brothers, 1858. But most of the insulators, telegraph insulators, were made in the 1870s or so, and they came in some nice colors. Some more medicine bottles and some flasks. And this just illustrates the diversity of lipping tools that you'll see at the Lineborough Glass Factory. So when they blow a bottle into the mold, and then at this time they had what's called a snap case, and they would be able to hold the bottle in place. Then they would be able to break it off from the top where they blew the bottle, and they'd be able to use a lipping tool and form the lip. Drop a little blob of glass and form the lip. So this shows you the different kind of lip treatments. Some other markings that you'll see on some of the Lineborough glass, the LGCO that you'll see on the base, Lineborough Glass Company. That just shows some insulators and some demijohns. And you know, the canning jars were fairly new. That's like late 1870s. The Yeomans, the Eagle, the Hero Improved, Lightning, Puritan, Pearl, Hero Improved, yeah. But they all had different types of clasps and you know, ways of being able to secure it and preserve. And then there's one bottle here. This would have been done earlier. This is 1850s, but it's one that's been in my collection and one that I was happy to be able to show you. And there's one here as well. And I think they're the only two that I'm aware of. I've been collecting 30 years, and this is the only one I had seen until I saw the one in the museum. But that's CSP Sanderson Apothecary, Pittsfield, New Hampshire. And that's an early bottle. It has the Pownal scar on the base and the applied lip. Could have been done late at Keene, but I think Keene was probably closed down at the time, so I'm not quite sure. I tried doing some research, and Sanderson's store looks like it would have been right across the street over here. There's Oak and Chestnut. We're in that, where the hotel, is there a hotel here? Oh, this is it, okay. And so Sanderson's store would have been right across the street. Maybe somebody can shed more light than I can, but I tried to do a little research. I found something in one of the newspapers, New England Farmer, from 1861. It says, on Wednesday 19th, C.P. Sanderson, apothecary of Pittsfield, New Hampshire, received a bullet in the neck from a pistol in the hands of a young man who was carelessly exhibiting it in his store. The ball, at last accounts, had not been extracted. It is thought that the wound would not prove fatal. That's all I can find. But you know, part of the fun of collecting is doing that kind of research. So here's a couple of books that we use to do some research, and luckily we've got, you know, everything right at our fingertips. So you know, you can check out on Google or eBay or any of these places to find out information. But American Bottles and Flasks and Their Ancestry and American Glass, those were done. Those were written by the McKierans, George and Helen McKieran, and they're kind of like the Bibles of the glass world. How to date bottles too is, you know, like we talked about, the lipping and the Pownal scar, but that's a lipping tool right there, and you can see that they would drop the glass, put that part in the neck, and be able to just turn it, and it would make that form. Base Pownal marks, they come in a different variety. There's open Pownal glass tipped ones. Then there's iron ones that would leave sometimes that petal mark or that kind of graphite or iron look. Embossing is a great way to be able to tell the bottle. You know, the Farley's ink. If you look them up, you'll see that they were made in he operated in Marlow, New Hampshire, and from this date to this date, so you have a pretty good idea. Some of the early bottles, the black glass, have actual dates on their seals, which is great. And then another way to be able to figure out bottles is through provenance. Collections, family history, museums, auctions, dealers. I have some bottles that go back to the 20s and 30s that I'll be able to look and see them in auction catalogs, which is really kind of neat. It's a little bit of my collection there, but and it's gotten a lot worse. But, bottles at one time were the third most popular collectible, right after coins and stamps, and I don't know who did that report. It may have been Christie's or something. People collect all different types, from regions to colors, etc. That's about it. If you have any questions, I can answer your questions. Yeah.
I was just curious when they first came out with twist on.
Well, they started the automatic bottle machine in 1905, So that would have been mass production, and then the whole glass factory thing kind of went by the wayside. But once they started doing that, then I'm not quite sure when they patented the twist off, but it probably was right around that time.
Is there a difference between molded glass and pressed glass?
Molded is, it's blown into a mold, and well, I'm not quite sure how the pressed glass process is, but it's some sort of a pressing process into the mold. And a lot of that is solid glass, so whereas mold blown has air into it and it pushes the glass into the mold, this presses it and sometimes it's thicker, so like your candlesticks and things are made of thick pressed glass pieces. But you know, a good place to really learn more about that, and I was down there a couple of times, I should have learned more about pressed glass, is the Sandwich Glass Museum down in Sandwich, Mass. They have a lot of things on display, and they actually have a glass blower there all the time doing work. It's pretty neat.
So is it hard for you to distinguish the difference in the fancy cut glass that they started to produce in the States?
Oh yeah, you can definitely
Okay.
tell the difference.
Yeah.
You know, cut glass, it's all made by little facets. This has got concave, and you know, it's if you feel inside, it's molded.
Gotcha. A little smoother, probably the cut's a little sharper.
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit about where you have found a lot of your collectibles?
In auction catalogs. Back in the day, you know, I used to be able to dig and had some pretty good success scuba diving in some of the small towns that would have rivers running through them. So I'd find some things, usually not the kind of things that I collected. I can tell you that this bottle here, it's Old Continental whiskey, and it has a picture of a General 1776 on the other side. And it's a beautiful collectible bottle. And when I was in my early 20s, I was scuba diving in Peterborough, and my foot, I ended up hitting a sandbar, and it felt a piece of glass or something down there. I didn't know what it was. Reached down, pulled it up, and I pulled up this bottle. But it wasn't this exact one. It had a little bruise on one of the corners because they're pretty thin corners. So I ended up selling it, and back then I sold it for $3,000, which was all the money in the world. But I kind of missed it, and later I was able to buy one, and it kind of reminds me of that piece. So I had to pay a little bit more.
So I suppose when you find them like in the water, they're more intact than if you're digging.
Yeah, a lot of times they're preserved by the mud and the sand, and in fresh water, you know, they come out nice. In salt water, not so nice. I've been diving in Portsmouth Harbor, and that's such a rough current going in and out of there that the bottles just end up tumbling across the bottom, and they don't look
How
so
many
good.
bottles do you have?
Probably about 800. Yeah. I tend to lean now more towards the ink bottles because they're smaller. Less on the demi-johns.
Is there one person credited with designing that lily pad design?
No, but as far as who was the master of creating them, it would be Matt Johnson. Yeah. But I think you probably would see that design in earlier traditions, but he really mastered it.
What were the molds made of?
Iron. Yeah, and sometimes you'll see a bottle like the one from Pittsfield here that has like what they call whittling, you know, and people think that that's because of a wood mold. It's because the glass hit what was a cold iron mold, and the glass would kind of wrinkle on that when it would hit it. So it would give the impression that it's like whittled glass, but it's not from a wood mold.
You ever find any molds?
No. There is one in Cheshire Museum of this, the iodine Springs bottle. And that was found in Stoddard back in the 1960s or so when they were doing expansion of the highway there. So that's, I think, still on display over there in Cheshire Museum. Yeah.
Have you ever found like pieces of bottle and put it together again?
Yeah, especially from Temple, we found some pieces and it ended up making it into the shape of a big globular type bottle. But it was missing the whole top, but it was really neat to kind of recreate. And a lot of people that do excavation work, especially in pottery and in glass, they'll actually use tape and make a form from the pieces that they find. Yeah.
Is that your sign on the end of Chichester cutoff that says, looking for old bottles?
No, but I gotta learn who that is. No, not me. There's a lot of crazy folks out there like me, though. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, go ahead.
So if you were to sell all your bottles, do you know around how much it would be?
Enough to get me out of the doghouse. It would be a lot. Some collections can go into the hundreds of thousands or even the millions. I don't know off the top of my head. I try not to think of it.
Now, all your glass is just New Hampshire. Do you ever find any of the old European glass that used to come over? I mean,
Yeah, you find, I've got some bottles from the 1600s, and I've got a small collection of Stiegel bottles that were made in Mannheim, Pennsylvania in the 1760s and 1770s at the Stiegel Glass Works. And those have really nice designs on them, like a diamond daisy and herringbones and all these different designs. And they all, the ones that I have are all like in these lavender and pink colors, which are really beautiful bottles. But those are colonial bottles, and got some of the black glass things from the 16 and early 1700s as well. Yes.
What's the most valuable bottle?
Well, I have a bottle, and there's one in the Corning Museum, and then there's one in private hands. And I've got the third example. I got a text from a fella from Western Mass, and he sent me a picture, and he said, "Is this any good?" And I said, "Yeah, it's really good." And the last one had sold for $48,000. I ended up buying this one, and I think it's a nicer example. So the one in Corning will never be for sale. And this one that's in this private collection, it was passed down from grandfather to father and going to the son. So yeah, that might probably be my most expensive one.
What do you use? Do you clean the glass sometimes?
Sometimes the glass, like starter glass, comes out and it looks beautiful. And for some reason, a lot of the Limeboro glass, when it comes out of the ground, will be what's called sick glass. You know, it has that staining right through it. And sometimes you can clean it out if it's just you know, grime or debris inside. You can clean it out with, you know, less oil or any of these kind of products. Sometimes you have to give it to a professional cleaner. And what they do is they put it on a tumbling machine, and they put a slight abrasive, like if it needs an abrasive inside, they put a slight abrasive, and it just spins and spins for like sometimes days, and that'll clean the inside and get rid of some of that sick glass.
Notice he didn't say Windex.
That's my first try. So, is that it? Yep.
What causes, like, I have more modern glass, but some that's maybe from the early 1900s, but it turns purple in the Windex.
That's because it's clear glass and it has a manganese in it. And when you put it in the sun over a period of time, it'll turn that purple lavender color, which a lot of people do, a lot of people like it. You want to make sure that you're doing it with bottles that don't have a whole lot of value because it alters them, but it makes them look beautiful.
How do you clean your bottles?
Windex first. If that doesn't work, you try a more heavy solution, abrasive type solution. If that doesn't work, I give it to my buddy that has a professional cleaning machine.
Do you actually use like a wet brush?
Yeah, you use a wire brush inside to get some of the dirt and debris out of there. That certainly helps. All right.
Well, thank you very much.
Yep.
Do you own your very first piece of glass?
No, it got lost somewhere in the house. I wanted to save it as like a little memento, but it got lost in my folks' house somewhere. Oh well. I remember what it looked like.
I have a 9-year-old son back there who has a box full of
Oh, okay. I'll
glass
take a
in
look
his
at it.
room. And- Well, he didn't bring it, but
Oh.
he started off when he was 9.
Yep. Oh, good.
Well, thank you very much.
Sure,
Mike,
thank
for
you.
coming tonight. And,
Yep.
welcome to some cookies and water while it lasts. And if you are a member of this historical society, we thank you very much. If you're not a member and you'd like to be, see Liz. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.